Hello, I'm your friend and humble narrator, Lou Brutus, and recently Tobias Forge of Ghost was my guest here in the studio. However, he was not willing to be on camera, so what we did was hire one of New York City's finest and most expensive graphic artists to depict what it was like here in the studio.
Hi, I'm Samuel. I am 6 years old and I am already a professional artist.
Okay, a little underwhelming. I get it. However, do you know what real artists cost here in New York City? These people get a lot of money. Anyway, let's roll it. Hi, I'm Lou Brutus, honored to be joined by Tobias Forge of Ghost here in the studio. Tobias, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you for having me.
First of all, let's talk about a Pale tour named Death. It's been, I think, an incredible experience for you. Tell me about the pre-planning, the production, and the work that goes into it before anybody ever leaves their home.
Yeah, well, that's that's a big ordeal. I always hate starting tours, especially when it's like coincides with an album coming out, and also there's a slight schizophrenic element there as well, because you're technically doing it with characters that you don't know, and also we are in the fortunate position that we are growing. But we're not growing exactly the same speed, and the trajectory is not always as clear everywhere, meaning that sometimes you have to start a tour playing half is really good venues, the venues that you want to play in, and then there are some venues that you don't necessarily want to play in that doesn't allow for the production to be there. So you have to be something that, from a production standpoint, I don't like to be, and that is somewhat elastic. I don't like that. I want to be very, very non-elastic and do the same thing every night. This tour was better now because obviously I regard a Pale tour named Death sort of, in a way, we started that already in May. We just called it Rats on the Road because we only had the song Rats out. But technically, the tour started there, and that was a lot of the bigger, more emergency growing pains were there. Whereas this tour is quite, it rolls quite well.
Some of the venues you've played this year in the U.S. have been gorgeous historic theaters, and I'm wondering what the vibe is like in some of those places. Do you appreciate the history of some of these places?
I do. I mean, some of these the more aged theaters are definitely charming.
They have a vibe to them?
They do have a vibe. I don't know how many venues I've been to that are older than 30 years old who I've been told are haunted. Every place is haunted, apparently. And a lot of these older theaters are, as I said, very charming, very definitely possesses a vibe, and may even be possessed by a ghost or two. But especially when you're doing it on not the summer months, it's kind of cold, and that aging is not always practical. And as long as this place is a GA, general admission, meaning standing crowd, I'm fine. I'm not very fond of seats, which is a little bit of a thing on this tour where we're playing. Because of our production, we have ended up in a lot of rooms that cater to our production but still have a seated crowd. People generally have a tendency to stand up, so that's good, but the ideas of having seats and rows and people having to be confined to their designated seat is definitely breaking up the overall audience vibe you want on a show.
And certainly just kills the energy, too, and there's less of a
Yes.
communal experience, I think.
Yes, I definitely prefer when it's a GA.
Let us talk about the Prequelle album. The subject matter in it runs from modern back to the fairly ancient. I think perhaps we can begin by talking about the bubonic plague. My understanding of it comes mainly from a Defoe book called A Journal in the Year of the Plague. I'm curious if you've ever read that before.
I have not read that. I've heard about it.
Yeah, it's an interesting read. But where did the initial germ of an idea come for the theme of the record?
Well, I think that being European, I think that the plague, the Great Plague of the 1300s. There had been more plagues than that, but but the Great Plague of that is definitely something that is still in the sort of the inherited
Psyche.
collective
Yeah.
memory, because that was something that was deeply tumultuous for anyone who both perished and survived, I guess. And obviously, on the upside, it was extremely life-affirming for those who survived. And I think for anyone who's interested in the more morbid aspects of life, the idea of, especially when you're into metal, plague and death and the Black Death specifically is definitely part of black metal lingo. So it doesn't feel very far-fetched at all, coming from my aesthetic cultural background, playing in death metal, black metal bands. I wanted to make a record that was loosely tied to dark medieval ages, with the idea of a plague questioning your existence, without sort of physically explaining the medicinal physical aspects of the bubonic plague, more from a philosophical point of view and humanistic point of view. And because it's a nice, it functions as a good symbol for the end of the world, because the end of the world has happened many times. Of course, it keeps on happening.
And by end of the world, you mean collapse of civilization
Yeah,
for the inhabitants in a particular area, in this case, Europe.
yeah. I mean, in a way, mid 1300s. It broke out in 1347, and before that, you'd had a very, very rapidly growing gentrification of European cities. And a lot of people think that the 1300s was obviously extremely Stone Age, but that's not true. It was actually very progressive, and they, as I said, it was very gentrifying. People were moving into the cities, and that caused, or that laid the groundwork for the bubonic plague to spread. So there's a lot of comparisons you can make that you can draw to modern life nowadays. Also with and we're currently living in a sort of a pre-apocalyptic phase where I think all of us are sort of jokingly, I guess, but we're sort of referring to the old world as something that functioned, and we have sort of reached an edge of where we're about to possibly collapse. There's a lot of tendencies right now. There's a Cold War, several Cold Wars. We have big crew leaders that are fighting and picking fights with each other, and pollution, global warming, gentrification. I mean, just going through New York on a Monday morning you really see signs of I'm not sure if we were supposed to be this many in this little island, climbing on top of each other.
Now, the taking all of this and certainly the death aspect into the lyrical content, do you suffer a loss in your life and then directly want to write about it, or do you take the sort of aggregated loss in your life and that sort of builds up into something that you can then deal with artistically?
I guess a little bit of both. I mean, you can tap into your scar reading. As a writer, I think you'd always utilize things that you've in some way or form experienced.
Mm-hmm.
And experience might not be something that you have been exposed to either. It might be something that you've experienced seeing someone close to you being exposed to. And I think you'd always sort of cannibalize on anything that you know. You write what you know about, or what you're trying to interpret. This record in particular was definitely written in a state of mind that I probably might not have done had I not been in a certain state of mind at that point when I wrote it. And I wanted to make a record about survival, and it was written in a time where it was crucial for me to survive.
Do you think that's why it's resonated so well with people?
Possibly, but if it wasn't well written, catchy tunes, people wouldn't. I don't think that people will have just enjoyed it, reciting it. Just the poetic.
That's
side
actually
of it.
that's a great point, because you can come up with the greatest ideas in the world, but unless people can, hum it or dance to it, it's not really a very good song then.
No, I think you always need a certain amount of salt and sugar and spices in order to make a good dish. And yeah.
In the next segment, I'd like to come back to that idea. Tobias Forge of Ghost is my guest. I'm Lou Brutus. We are speaking from the HardDrive Radio Studios in New York City.